WordPress Accessibility Day 2024. How to read a VPAT and ACR with speaker Gian Wild, CEO at AccessibilityOz. This presentation was recorded October 2024.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to WordPress Accessibility Day 2024. My name is Kelly Crowley, and I'm an accessible design consultant, a writer, and a coach. I'm also a Paralympian and a member of the disability community. Thank you for joining us for How to Read a VPAT ACR with Gian Wild. Gian is the CEO of AccessibilityOz, which has offices in the US, Europe, and Australia. She has worked in the accessibility industry since 1998, when she was on the worked on the very first accessible Australian website. Her major achievements include 6 years active membership in the WCAG working group, her speech on the importance of web accessibility at the United Nations Conference of State Parties in 2015, and the release of the ICT mobile site and native app accessibility testing guidelines. In 2019, Gian won the inaugural Accessibility Person of the Year in Australia. She speaks at conferences in Australia, the US, Canada, South America, and Europe. During the webinar today, please feel free to use the Q&A section in Zoom to ask your questions, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. And you can use the chat to connect with other attendees. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gian.
Thank you very much. I am just going to share my screen. Okay. Let me know if you have any trouble, I was going to say understanding me, but because I'm Australian and there might be some non-Australians on the call, you may have trouble understanding me. In fact, I remember speaking at Michigan State University and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I just loved your presentation. Didn't understand a word you said, but I thought the speech was fantastic." And I thought, oh, that's not what we're going for here. So please let me know if you need me to slow down. I can talk fast, and I know the accent can be a problem for some. So today we're going to talk about how to read a VPAT. Well, really an ACR. We're going to talk about the differences of what those two things are. So firstly, meet our team. My team's a little bit different now. This is back in 2018, BC, I like to say, before COVID. I've been running AccessibilityOz for 14 years come April 2025. And I've always wanted to support people with disabilities by providing employment opportunities. So I wanted to make sure that my staff, or the percentage of people with disabilities in my staff, were more than or at least the population of people with disabilities in the general population. And I actually have never had any lower than 60% of my staff have some kind of significant disability that affects their daily life. And it's really important that you look at us and we all look very quote unquote normal. And that's really important to know, is that when it comes to disabilities, it's not something that you can necessarily tell just by looking at someone. We have Raf here who's wearing glasses. Could be that it was a very sunny day. He actually is legally blind, but you don't really know. People aren't always going to disclose their disability. It's really quite rude to actually ask someone if they have a disability. So you really need to assume that your audience has disabilities. So for those people who don't know, about 20% of any population has some significant disability that affects their daily life. And so over the years, we've had staff with dyslexia, moderate vision impairments, epilepsy, migraines, severe vision impairments, physical impairments, PTSD, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, and one that I haven't put on there yet, unfortunately, is long COVID. So I personally have been suffering from long COVID since I caught it at CSUN in 2023, so 18 months. And so all these things can can affect how people use websites. And the other thing to remember is that it's not just about vision impairments, especially looking at VPATs. I often see, we tested with this screen reader and full stop, that's all the testing they did. Well, there's a much larger group of people with disabilities than just people with screen readers. In fact, there's a much larger group of people with vision impairments than just people who use screen readers. And the largest group of people with disabilities who use the web are actually people with cognitive disabilities. So that's another thing to remember. Just very quickly going to speak this slide, but I'm not going to go into it in detail. In terms of our services, we work all around the world. So we were the accessibility partners for the Birmingham Commonwealth Games. We do audits, mobile testing, building websites, CMS testing, accessibility design, video accessibility, user testing, OS browser testing, consultation, and accessibility testing. And I put that in there because often people say, oh, I saw a presentation and we went with this accessibility company, and I was like, well, you could have come to us. And they're like, oh, we didn't know you did that stuff. So I thought I'd put that slide in. We have a few products: AusArt, our automated accessibility testing tool; AusWiki, our accessibility database of accessibility solutions, errors, solutions, examples; AusPlayer, our accessible video player; the accessibility fact sheets and accessibility voices and videos are all available for free on our website. And if we have time at the end, I can show you where they are, but you're also welcome to just go to our website and find them. The videos are aimed mostly at developers. The fact sheets are aimed at testers and developers and managers. So a little bit about me. Why should you listen to me? I worked, as Amber said, the very first accessible website in Australia, the Vision Australia Foundation website in '98. I created Australia's first automated accessibility testing tool in 2000, and I spent 6 years with the W3C working on WCAG 2. I worked on the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games and every Commonwealth Games since then. And then I spent 5 years managing usability and accessibility services at Monash. So for those people who are from a university or from a college, I feel your pain. I founded AccessibilityOz in 2011. We released AusPlayer in 2013, AusArt in 2014, and I spoke at the United Nations on the importance of web accessibility with regards to the massive fires that we had in Victoria a few years before, where over 50% of the people who died, so 160 people, I think, died, but over 50% had some kind of disability, which was quite appalling. There was a Royal Commission, which is like an investigation into it, and that was never mentioned. So it's really important, especially if you're dealing with emergency procedures, that everything is fully accessible. I was the inaugural Accessibility Person of the Year in 2019, and the last few years, as well as running AccessibilityOz, I've been chairing the mobile accessibility testing guidelines. So if you are interested in mobile accessibility, there's plenty of webinars and things on our website, and there's certainly a lot of information on how you make mobile accessibility thing. So let's talk about VPAT and ACRs. So what is the difference between a VPAT and ACR? So really, it's very, very easy. The VPAT is what you download from the internet, and the ACR is what you send to people or what a vendor sends to you. So the VPAT is basically the full template. The ACR is the filled out template, is the short version of that. So I'm going to use the term ACR instead of VPAT, even though the term, VPAT is more commonly used. So when I'm talking about an ACR, it's the filled out version, but they are used interchangeably. So basically, what is an ACR? It's an explanation of the accessibility compliance of a product. It's not a sales document, even though it often gets used as one. And it's basically a point in time where it says this is, at this point in time, where the accessibility compliance of this product is so we've got these issues, we don't have those issues, we fix these things. It's owned and often assessed or created by the product vendor, but it's always more accurate, I believe, if there's a third party that does the assessment. And in order to fill out the ACR properly, you really need to conduct a complete accessibility audit on the product. So it's not just a case of filling out a document. You have to do quite extensive testing to determine where the accessibility compliance of the document is, to then fill out the ACR. It's required by Section 508 in the US and almost all federal solicitations. It's very common in universities and colleges, and even in Australia, it's something that we sometimes can request, or my clients request, because it gives an idea of, where the accessibility compliance is and what people have done to meet those accessibility requirements. It's not actually, though, an accessibility audit report of a product. It tells you what the accessibility compliance is, but it's not actually an audit report. It's not only for government. It's something that can be used by everyone. And it's not only for web products. You can actually get an ACR for, your photocopier, or, your smart TV or something like that. It's unfortunately not always accurate, and I will talk about that in a moment. And it's not a good indicator of ATAG compliance. Now, ATAG is the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, very different to the web content accessibility guidelines. So the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, you'd want to apply them or test them when you're dealing with anything that authors content. So WordPress, for example. So an ACR of WordPress is not necessarily a good indicator of ATAG compliance for that particular product. So there are different categories: web products, operating systems, desktop software, photocopiers, telephones, tablets, smartphones, etc. And then when it comes to the sections of the ACR, they're always the same, no matter what you're testing, until you get further on into the WCAG section. So the first section is title, which should be the company name, and then Accessibility Conformance Report, name of the product, and the version. Now, the version, it's really important to have that information, because if you have an ACR on, version 2.4, but you're actually implementing version 3.5, then that ACR is not going to be very accurate. It's also important that there's a product description, and it's important that this is a good product description. I've looked at hundreds, maybe thousands of ACRs, and a lot of them are very salesy. And so it's really important that, as I said, it's not a sales document, it's actual description of what it is that the ACR, or what the product does. And then the report date. And so it's important to look at that as well and determine whether you're happy with how, old the ACR is. Then there's also contact information, and it's always important, I think, to have a phone number as well as an email address for an actual human and a human person's name, as opposed to accessibility@wordpress.org or something like that, so that there is actually one person who is responsible for this and that can be contacted. And it's also important that that person has the ability and the time to actually respond to any questions about the VPAT. About the ACR. And then there's notes. Notes often will mention things that might be excluded, or, maybe some information about when fixes will be completed, and then the evaluation methods used. And this is really, really important. Evaluation methods used should talk about sort of automated testing tools, automated accessibility testing tools, as well as manual accessibility testing, as well as some assistive technology testing, including mobile assistive technology testing. So often we have, we use these automated accessibility testing tools. We did this manual testing, and we tested with JAWS on Windows and, NVDA on Windows. And so then the question is, well, what about Mac users? And then the question is, how does this work on a mobile phone? Then you have the report information and the terms. So the accessibility section of the ACR is really, there's tables for each WCAG standard or guideline. So there's a table for WCAG 2, 2.1 or 2.2, depending on how old the ACR is. There's a table for level A, table for level AA. I haven't yet seen an ACR that has a table for AAA, but you can have it there if you want. And then there's additional sections for Section 508 requirements if the person uses it. So how do you tell if an ACR is reasonable in 10 minutes or less? And I do actually have an article that talks about these things as well, which I will post at the end. And I'm sure that you'll get access to this this video as well as my slides. So, red flags for ACRs. Having an inaccurate or unclear description of the product is a real red flag, because if someone doesn't know what their product does or can't describe it properly, then that's a real problem. But if they might know their product inside and out, but if it's just a salesy description, then they don't understand what the purpose of the ACR is. So that's another red flag. And does the notes section explicitly say that the VPAT does not cover essential features? So, for example, I saw an ACR for a video player that said captions are the responsibility of the author, and therefore any WCAG references to captions, it said not applicable. And the thing is we need to know if that video player supports captions, and it didn't answer any of those questions. So that's something to really look out for as well. Not dated is a real problem, and dated over 12 months is something that, kind of is a bit of a red flag for me. But the thing is, if it's dated over 12 months and you're still using the same version, then, it still could be accurate. But then my question would be, what have they been doing in the last 12 months? Is this product going to be maintained, etc.? Now, I've been running this presentation or versions of this presentation for 3 or 4 years. And I used to say in 2021 and 2022, with COVID, everyone's kind of got a bit of a backlog. So if it's dated 2019 and we're currently in 2022, then that's okay. But that's not the case now. I mean, we're almost into 2025 now. I still see ACRs dated 2018, 2019, and they're really, unfortunately, not worth the paper that they're written on. They really should be using the latest version. Now, the latest version of the VPAT is 2.5, which was released in November 2023, which, of course, is just under a year ago. Now, once again, this is something to kind of look at. If you're using the same version as what the ACR covers. But really people should be using 2.5. If there's no details of testing undertaken or generic descriptions like manual testing or automated testing or screen reader testing, then that's another real red flag. Other things is that if they only mention automated testing in the evaluation methods, then that's a problem. Automated testing can only identify about 30% of all accessibility errors. So if they only did automated testing, they're not going to find all the issues. And the same for screen readers. As I said before, screen readers are just one element of what you need to make accessible for a product. So if they need to mention more of that. And as I said before, no mention of mobile and mobile assistive technology testing. Now, the exception to that is, of course, if the product can only be used on a desktop. So with our government, with the Australian government, there are some products that are locked down to a physical environment and you're only able to use them on the desktops provided. Never is going to be open on a mobile device. In that case, obviously that testing doesn't need to be done. Other red flags, missing or inaccurate contact information. It's always a good idea to reach out to the person in the contact information, see how long it takes for them to respond. We did some work with a community college or a year and a half ago, and I reached out to the contact information on the VPAT during the 6 months I did work for them, and I got a response about 14 months after I emailed them. That's not good enough. You really need to receive a response within, I'd say, a week. Anything longer than a week is a real problem, and I'd really prefer it to be within 1 business day. Anything that says not evaluated in level A or double A in those tables is a real problem. That means we didn't bother testing it. It's applicable, but we don't care. That's probably paraphrasing. But anything that says not evaluated is a problem. Anything that has 1 VPAT for multiple products is also problematic because the VPAT or the ACR is quite detailed in terms of the level of conformance in any issues. And if it's covering multiple products, then it's really an indication that no real testing has been done, or at least no documentation of the testing has been done. And then cells without content. It's really important that when you look at an ACR, you've got the description of the WCAG criteria, you've got whether it supports or it doesn't support, and then you've got a third cell, a third column that is remarks and explanations. And that should always be filled out, whether that particular requirement is supports or partially supports or not applicable. There should always be text in that remarks and explanations to explain why it's not applicable, how you did meet it if it says supports, and what doesn't meet it if it says partially supports. If there's terminology like passes or fails, then that's a real red flag because the terminology is not applicable, supports, and partially supports. If there's a lot of not applicable, then that's also a red flag. And if it says all supports, then that's also a red flag. Now, I do say that there's certainly products out there that are fully accessible. I mean, in AusPlayer, where our VPAT, our ACR does say all supports, but we have very detailed explanations for all of those things. So it is true that there can be some products out there that may have an ACR where everything is accurate and it says supports, but we all know the products that we tend to use on a daily basis, whether it be Outlook or WordPress or whatever, tend to have some accessibility issues, and those accessibility issues need to be captured in the ACR. And it's also because it's a changing environment. Things change all the time. So often, we do a lot of testing and then retesting and then retesting. And, our clients often say, look, we're not going to fix this until, a year or 2 from now. And that's, accessibility can be a long-term process, and you can't make things accessible overnight. So that's understandable, but that needs to be reflected in the ACR. So that's what you should look for in terms of red flags. What does a good ACR look like? Have explanations under remarks and explanations for each criteria. Use conventional wordings such as supports, partially supports, does not support, and not applicable, and stand up to questioning, which I'll talk about a bit later. It's always a good idea to have an ACR written by someone other than the product vendor. That way, in most cases, it's more accurate, and it's not necessarily an attack on the vendors themselves, but the vendors are very, very skilled at building their particular product. They're not necessarily skilled at accessibility, and especially if you're dealing with a very small product, then basically it's possible that there's not a lot of accessibility information or knowledge within the vendor's organization. And so you really need you really need the ACR to be completed by someone other than the product vendor. An exception to that might be someone like Microsoft, because I know they actually have teams of accessibility people, and there's people who their entire job is writing ACRs, and they're incredibly skilled in accessibility, but that's not often the case. So it's really a good idea to make sure to ask or to look for an ACR that is written by someone other than the product vendor, so preferably an accessibility company. it needs to have a clear description of the product, including any associated features, and refer to the existing accessibility tools in the testing undertaken. So now that you know the red flags and what makes a good VPAT, let's assess the accuracy of an ACR. So first, read through the ACR, and does the ACR contain reference to known accessibility issues within the product? And if you don't know the product, then Google it. There's often information in, the W3C mailing list or the WebA mailing list about different products. So, learn what you can about the product and then see if the ACR has that information included in it. Read through the description. Does it accurately describe the product and its essential features? And read through the evaluation methods. Do they sound reasonable? And then look for any not applicables for features that the product definitely has. And if there are exceptions, are they reasonable, or will they block access to essential functionality? So you don't want to say, so for WordPress, I'm not saying that this WordPress, the ACR for WordPress says this, but as an example, if WordPress says we are not evaluating the functionality of the authoring system, then you'd be like, well, that's the main part of the product, so that really needs to be covered. So read through those things and then do some testing. So the easiest thing to test is the keyboard. So test the product with the keyboard. Just for those people who don't know, you use the tab key to tab between actionable elements and shift tab to tab backwards. The enter or space key to activate an element. And sometimes if you're on a menu or something like that, you might need to use the arrow key. If there's any pop-ups, they need to be able to be closed by using the escape key. So this is something that you can do. It might take you an hour or two to tab through and make sure you can fill out forms, you can watch videos, that you can do all the things that you need to do on that product. And if you can't, note them down because you're going to want to talk to the vendor about them. The next one to look at is 2.2.2 pause, stop, hide. So is there movement on the site? If there is movement, does it have an accessible pause feature? So that means it needs to be accessible to the mouse, keyboard, and touch, or does it stop within 5 seconds? If it does have those features, or it doesn't stop within 5 seconds, that information included in the ACR. Another part of pause, stop, hide is around autoplay of videos. So it's important to make sure videos don't autoplay, but if they do, the very first focusable link on the page, so when you tab into the page, needs to be able to pause the video. So that's something also that can be tested pretty quickly. Then there's 2.4.1 bypass blocks. Does every page have a skip link? And is it the first focusable link on the page? So the skip link is like a skip to main content or skip to the content. Often it's only available via the keyboard. So you have to tab into the page and it needs to be the first link that shows up. And that's a fairly common way of meeting bypass blocks. So if there isn't something like that, then is that included in the ACR? Now, the one page that doesn't need bypass blocks as in a skip to content link is the home page. There's ARIA, things around ARIA that you can do, but we won't go into any code in this particular course. So error identification. So another thing you can do is submit an empty or an incorrect form and determine if the errors are described appropriately. So, and if there are errors, do they have suggestions? And if not, is that included in the ACR? So for example, if you're filling out a form that requires your name and your email address and you submit it with an empty form, so no information, then the errors should say something like, please enter your first name, for example, Jane. or please enter your surname, for example, Smith. And the reason why you want to have that for example thing is because sometimes surname is not the correct terminology. I believe in the US it's last name or family name. So that sometimes can trip people up. So having that suggestion, we are all very familiar with the, Jane Doe or John Smith, can help people understand how to fill out the form. Then, consider doing a high-level accessibility audit if it's really important for you to determine exactly how inaccessible this is, or if you're doing an EAP, which I will talk about in a moment. So I don't recommend that you do a full accessibility audit, but maybe someone spending a day or two doing some testing can really help you determine whether the ACR is accurate. And the other thing that you could do is user testing with people with disabilities with assistive technologies. So you ask potential users who are people with disabilities who use their assistive technology to test it. But please remember that, these people with disabilities have their own jobs, have their own lives. They're not there just to do your testing. So it's always a good idea to provide some kind of monetary offer, or gift card or something along those lines, or if it's someone within your organization and you are maybe looking at lots of VPATs or lots of ACRs, allowing it to be added to their job description so they can allow time to do this kind of testing. Now, WCAG doesn't require that you test with users using assistive technologies. So, it's not necessary that the ACR says that it does this or that you need to do this, but it is a good way of finding things that, really trip people up. So it is valuable, but do remember that, you are basically using people with disabilities as expert testers, and they should be treated as such. And third, reach out to the vendor. And so this is where you need to, question. So why is this dated 14 months ago? Has the product not been updated in 14 months? Why did you say this section is not applicable when the product has this feature? What kind of testing did you do to ensure compliance? Why did you decide to fill out this ACR internally? Why does the description omit essential features of the product? Why did you decide to test with only one screen reader? There are a lot of partially supports. Do you have a timeline as to when these issues will be fixed? Now, I've been told I'm really harsh. So the organizations I've worked with when I'm looking at ACRs and writing EAPs often have to rewrite my questions. But there is a great product called goblin.tools. It's a website, which I've been using a lot recently. And basically you can put in your text and you can say, make this text more polite. So that I found makes my life a lot easier. But it's up to you how polite you want to be, because, this is a product that you're paying for. This is a product that needs to be accessible by law. And if it's not, then you have every right to question as to, why that isn't the case. And what next? Okay, so after that, what you need to do is develop a timeline. So that's something you can do with the vendor. So you can say, okay, it's not keyboard accessible, the search feature is not, can't be used by a screen reader, et cetera, et cetera. The vendor says that these things will be fixed by Q3 2025. And so also keeping in contact with them, making sure that timeline is met is also valuable. And if you can, update the contract to say, hey, we will, if you can, withhold payment if these things are not fixed. Or if you're already bought a product and you might say, well, we won't buy it again in the next year or something like that if these things aren't fixed. That's often, unfortunately, the best way to get a vendor to actually, improve accessibility compliance is to threaten to withhold funds or threaten to not purchase the product. And then this is something for US universities and colleges, what's called an EAP, so an equally effective alternate access plan. But I actually think it's quite useful for all organizations. And basically it says, hey, this particular part of the product, say, the search feature can't be used with a screen reader. The alternative is that we provide the people that might need to use this product with access to Be My Eyes or ARIA, so that they can call someone up on their phone or their computer. That person can take over their screen and do the search for them and then tell them what they see. Or for example, another one where there were articles in different languages, but those articles didn't have the correct lang attribute, which means that the screen reader wouldn't know what language to speak in. So it would, it might be French, but it would still think that it was all English text. So basically it's not going to be able to read that properly. Then, there's a pool of articles. So, you go through and you say, these are the 30 articles that are in those other languages. We're going to copy and paste them into Word. We're going to put the right language element in the Word document. And so we're going to say to users, if you come across an article that is in a different language, here is the database of Word documents that you can look at instead. So there's an alternative solution, but that's always kind of a backup plan. It's always much better for the system itself to be fully accessible. And any questions? So that's it for me. I have a couple of articles that I want to share with you, but please let me know. I'll pull them up, but please let me know if you have any questions.
Sharon, yes, we have a couple questions in the Q&A, and our first one is, what is the most common thing you see that needs fixing when making sites compliant?
I would say misuse of ARIA. So ARIA is for screen readers to access the content properly, and very, very often, people they like a little ARIA goes a long way. And so people who are new to accessibility think that ARIA is like the answer to everything without realizing that ARIA is only one very small portion of accessibility. And so they'll do some really stupid things like, sorry, this is me being harsh again, ARIA described by on images instead of alt attributes. And we came across one product where they'd added so many ARIA elements that when it came to the search, it was announced 5 times to the screen reader. And it just meant using the product was basically inaccessible because everything, it wasn't just the search, it was everything in that product was announced 5 times. And it just drove our screen reader user crazy.
Unmute myself. So that was very helpful. One of the next question is related to running your company. Would you be willing to say a little bit about your experience of whatever obstacles, systemic obstacles you've had to dismantle to build your own business, employing majority of your employees with disabilities?
So I think there is still a huge amount of discrimination against people with disabilities. And I found it actually in accessibility conferences a lot as well, which doesn't even really make sense. But for example, I went to a presentation to a community college where I went in and I had a walker, a rollator, because I have a condition that makes it difficult for me to stand. And I thought I did a fantastic job. I had people afterwards tell me who were in the session, oh, it's fantastic, you're exactly what we need, etc., etc. But the higher ups who were there said that I wasn't professional enough because I used a walker. And it was like, that doesn't even make sense. And also we're working in this accessibility industry, so we should support people with disabilities. So I have also seen it when the people that I hire, they are often dismissed more by clients, not all clients, but clients, if they have an obvious disability. They are often also assumed to know only about their disability and not accessibility as a whole. So our screen reader tester, Raf, is absolutely brilliant, does a whole bunch of accessibility testing, not just screen reader testing. But if he starts talking about, the accessibility of Instagram, people just switch off because they're like, well, how would he know? So, yet I get him to test the accessibility of Instagram quite regularly. So that, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that is definitely something that I have seen.
Sorry that you've had those experiences, and that I look forward to all of us building a world where folks don't have to go through what you've been through.
It just amazes me actually that it still happens. Especially in this industry, it's just amazing to me that it still happens.
Sure. So one other question here about I'd love to ask if you would be willing to expand on some ways that folks can think about the accessibility of content for people with intellectual disability and ways to evaluate that.
Yeah, that's actually people with intellectual disabilities, people with cognitive disabilities as a whole, often have been kind of left behind when it comes to the accessibility industry. WCAG 3 or WCAG Silver should improve on that. But actually, when WCAG 2 was released, it was released with a caveat that said that meeting WCAG 2 requirements would not be enough to make your site accessible to cognitive disabilities. And that was due to a letter that was written by Lisa Seaman, who was on the working group, and co-signed by a bunch of us because we were so concerned that there was so little with regards to accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities in WCAG. It is there, but it's all at level AAA. And as I say, level AAA is where success criterion go to die. So it often gets ignored. There's this thing called Easy English, which is fantastic for people with intellectual disabilities. But it's also important to know that people with cognitive disabilities, it's not always an IQ problem. It's often a reading problem. And so these people might find it really, really difficult to read a paragraph of text, but have no problem if it's read to them. I'm the exact opposite. If I read something, I can remember it. If it's said to me, I forget it immediately. But those people can use screen readers. So making sure that screen readers are actually accessible for people with cognitive disabilities, as well as people who use screen readers. And the other thing is that there's a whole lot of kind of concept of, always been a concept in the accessibility industry that a text-only site is the fully accessible website, and that is absolutely not the case. There's a lot of kind of theories that if you remove a whole lot of things from your website, it's going to be more accessible, and that's not the case. So having imagery, having icons, one icon to represent, each section of your site, having, if you have, I remember at Monash University, each faculty had a different color. So, and the menu, the header was all the same color when you're in that section. Those are the kind of things that you can help people with, you can do to help people with cognitive disabilities.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful. All right, I see no further questions in our Q&A, and we do have just a couple minutes left. Do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share with our audience?
Yes, so I wrote this article a couple of years ago. It's called The 5 Stages of Grief, aka Accepting Accessibility. And basically it's, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance in terms of how vendors respond when you say, hey, you need to be accessible. So I'm putting it into the chat. That's definitely, if you have been dealing with a lot of vendors, hopefully it will make you laugh and make you feel a little bit better that you're not alone. There's also an article back in 2019 called How to Read a VPAT, which is similar to what I've talked about today. I've got these things called the CCC developer videos on HTML forms and the dreaded ARIA. What is ARIA and why use it, how not to use it, etc. Aimed at developers. So that I'm also putting in the chat. And the other thing that might be helpful are these things called fact sheets. So we have fact sheets on images, PDF, video, interactive maps, HTML5, content, JavaScript, tables, coding, keyboard, source order, forms, and mobile. And each section has, just put it in the chat again, we have principles. So why would you want to meet these things? Impact on users as to what happens if you don't meet those things. It's a developer checklist, and it has actual correct and incorrect code, and a manager checklist, which is basically like a testing checklist. The automated testing tools and the WCAG guidelines, they're a bit out of date. I need to remove them actually. But those sections are still applicable. Now they're about WCAG 2. They're not about 2.1 or 2.2. But those things, will hopefully help people who are trying to learn more about this stuff.
All right, amazing group of resources there at the end in the chat, and really informative presentation, dynamically presented. So thank you so much to Gian for the presentation, and thanks to everyone for attending this session. You can continue the conversation in the chat or on social media using hashtag WPA11YDay and hashtag WPAD2024. We also appreciate it if you would go to 2024.wpaccessibility.day/feedback to provide anonymous feedback for our speakers on their presentations. You can enter to win a t-shirt while you're there. And stay tuned for how to design and implement accessible cards coming up next at 5 o'clock UTC. While you're waiting, don't forget to visit our sponsors pages to grab virtual swag and enter for a chance to win great prizes. See you all right here after the break.
Thank you to WordPress Accessibility Day 2024 sponsors. Platinum sponsor 20i. Easily build, deploy, and manage all your projects with 20i managed WordPress hosting. One UI for all your servers, apps, sites, databases, security, DNS, and email. Perfect for agencies, e-commerce, developers, multi-site hosting, and high-traffic sites. Platinum sponsor Equalize Digital. Since all they do is accessibility, every post on their blog is an accessibility resource. You can find webinar recordings, articles, and additional resources at equalizedigital.com/resources. Platinum sponsor, WP Engine. WP Engine provides the most relied upon and trusted WordPress products for businesses, brands, and agencies of all sizes. Thanks to our gold sponsors, GoDaddy, Grackle Docs, Gravity Forms, Green Geeks, TPGI, and Yoast. And thank you to our silver sponsors, CodeGeek, Drake Cooper, Elementor, Overnight Website, Pressable, Second Melody, and Accessibility Collective.